Shalom Rav, good afternoon. We have the pleasure today of talking with Professor Don Handelman. On my left is newly promoted Professor Carol Cedron from the Department of Anthropology at Haifa University. I'm Eyal Ben-Ari. I was at the Hebrew University. Now I belong to the Jerusalem Institute for Strategy and Security. And Don, I would say, probably is the foremost Israeli anthropologist, both historically and today, still. And I can already see the smile at the edge of his, now fully on his face. He's been in the anthropological business for about 30 years, since 1963, and he's been a member of the Academy since 1998. Don is both a friend of ours. He was a colleague of mine. If I'm not mistaken, he was Carol's supervisor.
My mentor.
And your mentor. And we thought we'd discuss a few things in and around anthropology and Don's place in anthropology. So, Carol, please.
Don, great honor
Thank
to
you.
be the one to be asking this first question. Tell me your foundational constitutive myth or narrative. How did you become an anthropologist?
Yeah, it's a very simple one. I was a awful BA student at McGill University. And after I finished the 4 years, I really didn't know what to do with myself. And so I thought this, that, and the other, and every possibility received a negative from me. But I saw that I had 1A in a course during those 4 years, and that was the Introduction to Anthropology. So I thought, well, maybe I'll give that a try. And that's what happened. I chose anthropology, and can I say that anthropology chose me? No, I can't actually. Anthropology kind of threw me out, or tried, and I snuck in through the back door.
Okay.
Still here.
Still here.
Yeah, that's the founding myth.
After all these years.
Yeah.
Now, as part of your path into and within anthropology, we know that scholars are never actually alone. So I'd like to ask you about the people who, in anthropological terms, who were your significant others, either people you knew personally, or people who touched you both intellectually or in terms of insights, special insights, and so on.
I'll take them in order. The first was Irving Goffman, whom I met much later. Now I'm back at my actually my MA, and then continuing on to the PhD with Goffman's influence. But Goffman's work introduced me to the idea of encounter in interaction. That is, when two or more people would meet, interact, they would be creating an encounter. His theory of encounters, he left after one essay. It was very rarely used. I picked it up for in my doctoral work, and I'll get to that if we have time. I'll get to how I used it later on. Now, when I finished my MA at McGill University, I went to do PhD studies at the University of Pittsburgh. That was in 1965, actually 64. And on the way, I stopped to do some field work in Nevada, long way around, and I met a man named Henry Rupert. Henry Rupert was a shaman, and I spent the summer listening to him. And something happened to me in the course of interacting, our encounter, Henry's and my own. Henry gave me a basic course in phenomenology. Actually, I learned more from him about cultural perception than I learned from anyone else during the 60 years that I've been peddling some kind of anthropology. And I'm forever grateful to him. And I have to say that actually putting him into the list of significant others is quite akin to the vocation of anthropology, more than other disciplines that I can think of. Henry, in 1998, and he was long dead. When I met him, he was about 80 in 64. In 1998, I went to meet someone whom I hadn't met, but that I knew of, and this was a shaman named Jonathan Horowitz. I went there with my friend Galina Lindquist, because we worked together, and she had studied with Jonathan as part of her doctoral work on shamanism in Sweden. And so Jonathan did a healing session on me. And during the healing session, as I was lying on the floor, listening to this mumbo jumbo and the beating of drums, so forth, Henry appeared. He leaned over me. I was looking up. He leaned over me. He put his lips on my lips and breathed life into me. This is what I felt. And then he said to me, he said, "Know through your feelings, but know." And actually, this is something that I've pondered ever since and has fed into my anthropology. Know through your feelings, but know. Well, we usually separate the objective from the subjective, right? The feelings from rational knowledge and so forth. And here he was telling me they go together, but you have to know. So you have to know how to understand your feelings. In another, how to feel your feelings, how to feel your rationality. And it did influence my work later on India. So Henry is certainly there. Bruce Kapferer, whom I met in Manchester when I moved from Pittsburgh to Manchester to do my field work. Well, Bruce and I have been friends since 1966, very close friends. And he's had a great influence on my work in many, many, many ways. I won't go into details here about that because it's a sort of, we've had a continuous, ongoing relationship of discussion and criticism. Often more criticism than discussion, but the next is Gregory Bateson, whom I was introduced to, not personally, but to his work in Manchester by a sociologist named Wes Sharrock, who later became a professor of sociology at Manchester. And Bateson, interesting, because in my doctoral fieldwork, I encountered play among the older people that I was studying. I had never encountered this before in a emergent way, because the play unfolded before me as I was watching and interacting with these people. And Bateson gave me the key to opening this puzzle and thinking about this puzzle. The next was Victor Turner. Vic I met quite a few years later, and I was lucky enough to spend 2 weeks with him in Japan around 1980, 81, I'm not sure of the date any longer. Turner was, for me, he was an amazing, what to call him? He felt, sensed, and knew what ritual was about, and ritual became one of the subjects that I spent a lot of time on. He was also an extremely generous man. He was generous, he was kind, he was actually unlike any of the senior professors in anthropology that I had met up until that time. So we remained friends. Well, he died in 1983, I think. So we were friends for a period of a number of years, and that to me was a very valuable experience. But Vic was also, and Bruce is writing about this at the present time, he was a rebel. And his break with Manchester, with his own supervisor, Max Gluckman, who was also my doctoral supervisor, his converting to Roman Catholicism, which in the British context was understood among academics as a rebellion against the canonic and so forth. And the last that I would mention is David Schulman, who is extremely well known to the Academy, l'Accademia. David, I went to Sri Lanka in 1979 to do a little field work. And when I came back, my field work there dealt with, related to Tamils and ritual. And when I came back, I was talking to someone at the Hebrew University, and that person told me that I really should talk to David Schulman. And then I discovered that David lived a 5-minute walk away from me. So indeed, I talked to David Schulman and talked and talked and talked and talked. David had only finished his PhD only a few years before. This was around 1980. And he was warm, welcoming, encouraging. I knew nothing really about Hinduism, but with his help, his generosity, I was able to progress. Later on, we worked together. We published 2 books together. I published another small book, also with his help. And David is a polymath. David is an amazing man. David, and I'm ready to put this on record, David may really be a genius. So I owe him a tremendous amount. I mean, these are the people who really have not only helped me in so many ways, taught me in so many ways, but also touched me very deeply.
Don, if you could please tell me how you define anthropology. I know that's a loaded question, and I would add as a subscript to that, that I will never forget, and it's useful to me every day as an anthropologist, when you taught me that concepts are to be used as long as they allow us to open up tacit experiences in the field. And when they do not open up those experiences for us, we can throw them out, which I think is an amazing expression of your uniqueness beyond the people that have impacted you.
Well, we have to realize that everything, all of the research that we do is provisional. None of us are coming up with results, with thoughts, with theories and so on, that will simply stand. And so, to my mind, the major purpose of concept, of conceptualization, of theorizing, is to open a door. But once the door is open, whether a concept is useful or not depends on what we find on the other side. And if it's not useful, throw it out. Throw it out. We have to think in another way about how to deal with whatever it is that we find. So yes, throw it out. The problem with all academics, including myself, is we like to hang on to concepts that we've thought about and so on, and hang on and hang on. It's an error. We have to let go. And actually, someone else who has had a great impact on me in a narrow way is the American polymath Charles Sanders Peirce on his logic of abduction. He posited abduction as a third logic of inquiry, apart from the deductive and the inductive, which all of us learned in the course of our graduate studies, endlessly, endlessly. What Peirce is saying is surprise. The world is full of surprises. And that's what we need to explain. And that's where the abductive logic begins, with a surprise. Now, for anthropologists who do field research, if they are not surprised, their research is a waste of time, plain and simple. And so one of the difficulties now is graduate students are told theorize everything. Theorizing everything, when they get to the field, their perspective is much more narrow, and the likelihood of their being surprised is, again, much less. And this is, to my mind, it's a tragedy. Define anthropology. All I can say is that when I found it, it was the most open of all disciplines in the social sciences and in the humanities, the most. In anthropology, you could go in any direction. If you wanted to, you could do history. If you wanted to, you could do psychology, economics, politics, everything. You could go in any direction, which was the most marvelous. Because anthropology dealt in the first instance with what made the human being a human being. The humanness of the human in a myriad of ways. And it is the humanness that we have that endows us with imagination and with creativity. And without those qualities, we don't have a valuable anthropology that continues to surprise us. There's another aspect that I wrote about in a paper published in Poetics Today in, I think, 1995. I've never seen it raised this way, and of course the paper went the way most papers go, into the trash. Anthropologists, since the beginning of fieldwork anthropology, so usually Malinowski is given as the founding father of fieldwork research. We have gone to the field to meet others as subjects, subject to subject. We've tried, at least in my generation, to hold on to that. We slip because when we come out of the field, we are forced by the nature of the publishing world and our communications with one another to begin to objectify. But still, we get continuous reminders of the subject-to-subject relationship. In the subject-to-subject relationship, there are no artificial boundaries. There are all kinds of blockages. There are all kinds of blockages because of differences in culture and status, and there are many factors involved. But we try hard to erase them. And we work on the assumption that the longer we are there and communicating with people, feeling affect for people, and so on, something of that subject-to-subject relationship will remain. Now, this is the only discipline in the social sciences and the humanities which places the subject-to-subject relationship at the forefront. All of the others objectify. There are some, like psychology, if we go into clinical psychology, that still retain something of that, but they've been pushed very much to the side, very much to the outside of the discipline. So we are the only ones who do that, for heaven's sake. And that's where the value of anthropology is really magnified. We deal with human beings. We're not putting in questionnaires. We're not putting in psychological testing, and so forth. So we have a unique discipline. And yet that uniqueness is continuously threatened by our weakness towards other disciplines, like cultural studies, by experts in watching television, reading literature, watching films, and so on, who lecture us on how they understand human being. But all they're talking about are representations. So we have a unique discipline. What is anthropology? Anthropology is that uniqueness, first and foremost. But we have to work to protect it continuously.
Yet, if it's a follow-on question, or to follow on from that question, yet when I try as your former student and somebody who's been really deeply influenced by your work, so much of the influence actually lies in conceptualization. From the days when I was a student a little bit before you, Carol, about play and ritual, to your later writings about public events, through the whole grappling with the ideas of forms and what they mean, emergence and processes and so on. And so I personally see a lot of your, to use a very common term in today's social sciences, probably sciences in general, your contribution lies there. Now certainly it's rooted in the subject-to-subject encounter. But looking back at your work, if I may ask, what do you see as your most significant or some important conceptual signposts, innovations, suggestions for comments and opening up discussions?
Well, I think it comes from what I'm calling now the forming of form. Not quite how to enter that. You know, I mean, I've been called recently. I've been called an outlier. I've been called close to being an anarchist, and I've been called someone with heretical ideas.
They all sound like compliments.
They actually all were compliments. Yeah. But I chose to downplay that.
Of course.
You know, I looked through my anthropology of the last 50, 60 years, and I recognize that I have this great curiosity about how social and cultural forms are made, shaped, and how they hold together. How they hold together through their practice, through what it is that they do. And this is something that anthropologists have given very little attention to. They don't ask questions like, how does a social cultural form hold together? Mainly, does it happen mainly from its inside? Is it held together within itself by what happens there? Is it held together mainly from the outside? Is there a kind of internal organization involved here? And if so, what kind? The internal organization in anthropology is rarely paid any attention to. You know, there are forms that once they're started up, as it were, continue until they complete, until they get to their goal, whatever it is. That is, in order to understand that, in my view, we have to understand the form, like a ritual, in its own right, in and of itself. And then maybe we discover what kind of internal organization it has. So I suggested that we take the ritual, say, out of its cultural context and examine it, and then put it back in. Examine it to find out what we can about its insides, as it were. I'll give you one example of a reaction to, to that suggestion. And I gave a lecture on this at the Institute of Indology at Heidelberg. When I got to the point of saying, and now I'm taking the ritual out of context, the senior anthropologist there stood up and said, "You can't do that." So these are the kinds of how shall I put it?
Heretical.
Yeah, they're heretical. They're heretical, and my attempts to explain this in a persuasive way to others failed completely. In the case of ritual, you know, there have been tens of thousands of articles written on ritual from a whole host of disciplines. Such an investment in the term ritual. How could it ever possibly change because some little pipsqueak insists that it's a wrong concept? It brings together different kinds of occasions, of forms, and so on that don't belong together. And yet anthropologists and others, historians, theologians, history of religion, scholars, and so on, sociologists, keep on churning out ritual, ritual, ritual. And they are not making any sense except through hiding the problems with the term and accepting the lowest common denominators to define the phenomenon of ritualization. I tried in a book called Models and Mirrors to argue that this roof idea of ritual, including all of these different kinds of, usually occasions that are described in functionalist terms. A ritual of this, a ritual for that, and so on and on and on and on. I compiled quite a list of how this was used, the term ritual, and it was inane in terms of real knowledge about phenomena. I developed a rule of thumb, which I proposed in that, but it's very simple. You're studying, say, a historical pageant in a town, a historical pageant which describes the development of this place through a variety of events that occurred during its history, beginning with the distant past and coming to the present. What happens if you run it backwards? Let's say, running it backwards, you start at the present, and you have a series of historical events, they can be the same events, going back to the past. You have a different story, but has the logic of this ritual changed? My argument is that it has not changed. You can run it this way, you can run it that way. It still remains the same kind of occasion. Well, let's say then that you take an exorcism. An exorcism in Sri Lanka, say an exorcism in which someone is possessed by the demonic, which has seized that person's soul, spirit. And the problem of the healers in through very complex rituals, is to get that demonic out. So they do it over a series, in this particular case, say over a series of fortnights. What happens if you run that event backwards? If you run that event backwards, what you're going to produce, or what is going to come out of this, is sorcery. Well, is taking the demonic out and putting the demonic in, do they operate according to the same logic? My argument was, no, they don't. So there's a problem there because there is transformation involved, the transformation of the person who is possessed. If there is transformation involved, and it's not simply a representation, which the historical event is a representation of history through a whole variety of scenes, of occasions that are commemorated. If there is transformation involved, you have to figure out what that transformation is and why. If you run it backwards, you're going to get the exact opposite of what you intend to do, which is to exorcise and not to sorcerize. And if you're going to put the exorcism together with the historical pageant under the rubric of a ritual, this is a ritual for this and this is a ritual for that, you're messing up the quest for knowledge, plain and simple. And you're doing it because you're stuck in the canonic ways of dealing with a particular subject. But as I say, a complete failure.
Right.
Complete failure. I tried again in the introduction to a collection called Ritual in Its Own Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I run up against the same, even when I'm using the term ritual. Take it out of context. Horrors. It just becomes... My only answer to the gentleman who stood up in Heidelberg and said, "You can't do that," was, "I'm doing it." But when I left that seminar, there were a lot of angry people.
Could you say a few words about, it's a continuation of this, about the way you've recently, in the past few years, started thinking about what you call Mobius anthropology, which, it's a half serious, half joking kind of image, metaphor, if you like. But I think it does characterize, I think both Carol and I, talking to you over the past few years, it characterizes your thinking.
Well, I'm not sure how to relate to it. I'm really not sure. Stephen Rosen, who is also a polymath, started as a psychologist, but he deals with the universe. He's an extremely talented man. I read his book based on Mobius, on the Mobius strip, the Mobius surface, and struck by the capacity to do away with the kind of boundaries, both in social life and in intellectual life, that we rely on to such a high degree. This is away from the topic, but I used to tell students, probably told the both of you, at some point, that we do our work putting a brick on top of a brick on top of a brick, and building. And another brick, and we block out the sun. Well, yes, we block out the sun. We become pedants. We live in our own brick dwellings, brick offices, and separated from others of our own kind and from people in other disciplines, for sure. I've been in a number of institutes of advanced study during my academic life. One of the interesting things is that sometimes these walls fell down. These walls fell down, or they became more porous, and we could go back and forth. Except that I remember one group, even there, at the Swedish...
The same German anthropologist?
No.
Peter.
These were actually, no, they were Swedes.
Okay.
They were Swedes at the Swedish Collegium, doing analytic philosophy, which I was very curious about. So I asked a lot of questions. They had a group there that were doing analytic philosophy together. So I remember once at lunch, the head of the group said to me, just in a casual tone of voice, "You ask too many questions." And then they took the group and gave it a special time to meet, which would be only for members of the group and not for onlookers. But they also kept their venue where onlookers were invited. So they suffered that in order to have their own separate... So what does Mobius do? Mobius says that, suggests that if you're inside the Mobius strip, if you're moving on the Mobius strip, you don't know if you're inside or outside. You have a seamless passage from inside, outside, and so forth. Take, for example, the opposite. A good book by Eviatar Zorbavel called, I think he calls it The Line, which is about boundaries, straight lines that separate absolutely. This is how we usually think of boundaries. You know? What is this theory called now in sociology and anthropology and cultural studies and, oh, I can't remember. My age is getting to me.
No, it's too many fashions.
Buzzwords. You used to call them buzzwords.
Buzzwords.
Do you remember you brought us a piece of paper one day in class with a list of them and showed us how nonsensical it is?
Yeah, that's true. Well, intersectionality now has conquered
That's true.
a number of disciplines, sociology, cultural studies, and so forth. But what is it? What is it? It's the clear-cut definition of, let's say, race, and of class, and they're meeting one another. I said, wait a minute. Wasn't this covered a long time ago by how variables interact and so on? Isn't this covered all the time by anthropologists who, of course, whatever they meet in the field, they're meeting race, they're meeting class, and so forth, they're dealing with this. Now there's a whole theory about it as if it's brand new, as if it's something special. This kind of thinking is anti-Mobius. Because all of these factors go through, of course they go through one another. And as anthropologists, we meet this. We meet this, and in meeting it, we study it. And maybe there are surprises there that awaken us to something else, to something interesting. Yeah. So there is this underlying conflict, smashing into one another of the subject-subject and the subject-object. And the subject-object wins because it's so much easier to objectify, to objectify and play with the objectification. Historians, cultural historians, the new cultural history, although it's 40 years old, will insist that they really learn through the texts what these people were like. But my only answer to that is these have to be representations. Mobius, if you think of the anthropologist and of the other in Mobius terms, they are continuously running into one another even if they don't know where. This is why the anthropologist also can do field work right here on this filming.
True.
Right? And possibly come out with something interesting. So for me, Mobius has become a kind of way of thinking about intersections that are not intersections. Changing the intersection, changing the straight line into curve. And the curve is critical. The curve is all about iteration, reiteration. It's all about intersection. It's all about generating form, because with a straight line, you'll have a great deal of difficulty in generating a form that will hold together, unless it's held together from the outside. But if a form is curving inside itself, yes, it's going through itself all the time. See? And it's going through itself all the time without assigning, without naming what these curves are. Even as curves, they are going to intimate that something is being not only held together, but is being created and recreated through movement.
Could you give an example?
Yeah, I'll give you the example of two kinds of cosmos. The monotheistic cosmos, all three of them, are held together from outside themselves. They're held together by God. God is outside cosmos, outside the cosmos that He has created. He has given information to His people or the people of the cosmos. And these are rules, etc., for them to follow. If they don't, they will be punished. But that will not threaten God. God remains God outside His cosmos. There are arguments that God may feel very unhappy, may even suffer from this self-destruction that His people are causing, but it won't threaten Him. God will not commit suicide over the end of His people. That's one kind of the way in which a cosmos is held together. And it's not a curving cosmos, at least not from my perspective. Because the orders come down. The orders are holy. And what's interesting about this is that the way in which God is separated from human being, from His people. In the Judaic instance, which is the revolutionary one of a surviving monotheistic cosmos, because there have been others that did not survive, is that to try and reach the Almighty, you hit against paradox. And I learned about paradox from Bateson. You have, say, information that takes the form of a curve. that can do what it does but cannot explain itself. In order to explain itself, it needs a meta level. The meta level can do what it does, explain beneath, but it cannot explain itself. And so you keep on adding and adding and adding and adding, higher and higher meta levels. How do you close this? I think that the way you close it is through paradox. And given the monotheistic mindset, if we run up against a paradox, we're stuck.
Right.
Being stuck, we cannot go any further. And so it is extremely difficult for us to reach the Almighty. And there are very few instances. There are sects and so forth who work on this and succeed to some degree. But in the mainstream, no, we do not. Christianity introduced Christ. Christ is a God-man. Christ moved this way and that way. His mother was a virgin birth. Another intermediary, but one of great difficulty for canonical Catholicism. Right? And so as a human being who gave birth as a virgin, she had all kinds of human qualities,
Right.
which the church took away from her, one by one, until now she's only left with tears. She can only cry. See? So it created problems, but still an attempt to change, but it only works up to a point. Yeah. On the other hand, we have a cosmos, Buddhist, Hindu, which is inclusive. It contains everything and there's nothing outside of it. So its curvatures, its curvings within itself, between gods and people and other beings and so on, are continuously, recursively maintaining, strengthening, and if weakening, finding another way to strengthen and so on. If the cosmos is endangered, everybody goes. Gods, human beings, demons, what have you, they all go. Because the entirety is held together within itself. Yeah. So this is more Mobius thinking. It happens to be also more systems thinking.
Right.
Yeah. Systems thinking has to be recursive. Although whether meta levels are really necessary in systems thinking is another issue. It's not a given. Although there are many systems thinkers that insist, of course, that it is. Going to the meta, how shall I put it? In the monotheisms, we always go to the meta. And in intellectual thinking, in universities and elsewhere, introducing the meta as a way of explaining is so common.
Right.
But that's less true, I think, you see, in religions like Buddhism and Hinduism. I even thought, I still think, that in Hinduism, at least from perhaps the 16th or 17th century, it's potentially possible for a human being and God to switch places, at least for a short period of time. But here again is the curvature of Mobius. And you may not know whether you're a God or a human being. You know. One of the books that I wrote with David Schulman, called God Inside Out, is about the god Shiva playing dice, a certain kind of game of dice, with his wife Parvati. Now Shiva, for Shaivites, for believers and followers of Shiva, knows everything. Shiva knows everything. He knows everything, past, present, future, what have you. But he's losing the dice to his wife. He can't understand it. He can't understand it. And he loses. He loses. He goes off in a huff. She's extremely upset because although she won, she doesn't have him. And so Mobius, these curves inside out, inside out, inside out, when you don't know where you are in relation to someone else, someplace, what have you. So to get away from the straight line, the straight lines that divide, the straight lines that use bureaucratic logic, which I've also written about, yeah, which organize in a very neat way and organize in levels, and of course the higher ones are meta and the lower ones, etc., etc. Get away from that. To get away from that and to open up to the world as I think it is, because that's where we came from. Initially, we had to be recursive beings. That we've succeeded in destroying that in the process of building certain kinds of civilization is a fact.
Yes.
Yeah. Whether we can go anywhere else remains to be seen.
Don, so for a final question, how would you say anthropology has changed? And if you allow me one little bit of an extra question or comment, it seems to me that you're an example of an amazing process of Mobius, because unlike a lot of the new Deleuzian and ontological turns, it seems to me that you are constantly moving backwards to enfold what was and curve in new ways, and others are just moving forward to pretend that they're reinventing the wheel.
Well, you know, that's something for other people to judge. I mean, I can't. I really can't. It's very difficult for me to. I can't even say it, because if I say it, I'm doing it, and so I won't. But you asked me how anthropology is. I think anthropology has changed. Yeah, I mean, but one point is this emphasis on theorizing everything, which I think is a terrible error. I know that when Aeyal went to Cambridge, basically the courses involved fieldwork problems and so on.
That's it.
And then you went to the field.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And you learned about theorizing on the basis of what you found there.
True.
And I think that's the right way to go. Look, there are conflicts between the different disciplines, philosophy, history, say, and I'll put in anthropology. But anthropology rather as a target. Mainly philosophy and history fighting it out in the humanities for which is the chief discipline, which one wears the golden halo, and philosophy usually wins, and in this case, philosophy also is winning in anthropology.
True.
Because we are told now that if we don't study the philosophers, we don't know where our knowledge comes from. And if we don't know where our knowledge comes from, do we really understand it? And the answer is no. So what's happening now? Theorize everything, begin with the philosophers. Of course, I mean the ancient philosophers, but then, of course, the philosophers of the 18th and 19th century.
Preferably French.
Well, no German, actually, preferably German. French only mainly post-World War II.
Okay.
But only for a period.
Yeah.
Because what is called philosophy in France today is considered a weak version of all of that. So theorize everything also means getting tangled up with a great deal of mediators that separate you from your field work. You're told you have to see your field work through them and their interpreters. I think that's highly problematic. As I said initially, in terms of the imagination and the creativity that an anthropologist can generate through field research. Cultural studies, Cultural studies in the 1980s almost destroyed anthropology. That is, this was the great American contribution to anthropology, was bringing in cultural studies. And all these people who didn't have a clue about human beings, except as representations. Another problem is speed, the increase in speed. Everything has to be fast. The kind of grants you apply for, you get a limited period of time, and you have to produce results. Research has to be goal-orientated. You don't have time to think. You don't have time to ponder, to deliberate. You have to write a report and so on and get your results out. Another problem is how the journal article has pushed out the monograph in anthropology.
True.
The monograph is critical because it gives the anthropologist space to go into, in depth, the depth that is in the society and the social orderings that the anthropologist has studied. When the anthropologist is forced to produce articles of somewhere between 5,000 and 8,000 words, something like that, everything has to be compressed. You can't go into cases in depth. You have to produce an example of this and an example of that, and it has to be quick. So this is a tragedy, in my view, that the monograph little by little is disappearing, and people like us, in order to get ahead in the universities, have to produce articles. And at least in the Hebrew University, it has to be according to this pyramid of proportionality, which is murderous for young scholars. But of course, the journal article it's easier to read. You read the abstract and so on. The citation index is in operation. The citations of the article in the issue of the journal, as Carol once told me, all of this stuff, all of this numerization of, which is easy to grasp and so on. But for a discipline like anthropology, it is potentially it's a disaster. I don't know. That's my view of how anthropology has changed.
Can we end with something optimistic?
From me? I should give you something optimistic.
How could the heretic be an optimist?
Well, the optimism is, my friend Bruce Kapferer, who is a year younger than I am, he's 82, and he works furiously. And I admire, I say, my gosh, if he'll go on, when he's 90, he'll be doing the same thing, if he lasts. Yeah? That's the optimism that I can think of, that there are people like that.
Creativity.
Yeah. Otherwise, optimism, I don't see it. I see in anthropology, I see cancel culture. I see critical race theory demands that the history of anthropology be understood differently, without taking into account whatever the problematics were of the anthropologists at the time. Because there is an ethical issue involved. And the ethical issue is that those people were not ethical by today's standards.
Exactly.
So we do away with them. We make fun of Margaret Mead on the cover of her photo on the cover of the American Anthropologist, sitting next to a pile of skulls from New Guinea. How can she be doing so? How could she do something like that? Didn't she realize how demeaning this was for New Guinea peoples? And it goes on and on and on and on. It's facile.
Yeah.
So no, I can't give you an optimistic and optimistic.
That's what we were expecting.
Look, it depends on the qualities of the individual anthropologists who have to make their way. And it has to do also with their ethics, of what we used to call their morals.
Right, right,
Because I don't see the difference.
right.
There is none.
So, תודה רבה.
תודה רבה לכם.